talked a lot about this one particular trans inmate. So his real name is Brian Kim, but he identifies as a woman named Amber Faye Fox Kim, right? Amber Faye Fox Kim. Okay. So, not the only transgender inmate in the state, certainly, but Amber Faye Fox Kim, aka Brian Kim, has made the news quite a bit because he has complained a lot about his treatment as a transgender inmate, and he's done so publicly. And so he's been at the center of a lot of news coverage, most of it sob coverage from the leftist media. I mean, The Stranger wrote a whole story on Brian Kim and the woes of Brian had gone on a hunger strike because he got removed from the women's prison. Brian had been in the women's prison because the state's just like, oh, you say you're a girl? Go ahead, like into the women's prison. But of course, as you know, there was an issue in the women's prison. Brian got caught having sex with a woman. And so they sent him back to the men's prison. And The Stranger did this sob story about how could they do this to this inmate, and didn't mention one time that Brian Kim is a double murderer. We'll get to more of that in a moment. But Brian Kim brutally murdered his parents. And so it was a sob story about, oh my gosh, his treatment behind bars is horrible as a trans inmate. No mention at all. Double murderer. So that's ridiculous. And this article from the Seattle Times that came out late yesterday, no better. So the Seattle Times headline, trans woman argues move to Washington men's prison is cruel punishment. Good God. You'd think maybe the Times would want to cover, if they care about covering something on the trans agenda, like talk about our story about a medical doctor being hired specifically for trans inmates, or them wasting money in the middle of a budget crisis on providing laser hair removal to trans inmates. Like any of that stuff. No. We have to do another sob story about the trans inmate who complains a lot publicly because they can't get what they want behind bars after killing 2 people. So it says a transgender woman filed a court petition Tuesday arguing that her transfer to a men's prison, where she has been in solitary confinement for months, constitutes cruel punishment. Kim's transfer came about 3 months after she received an infraction for having sex with another incarcerated woman. No. She didn't have sex with another incarcerated woman. He had sex with an incarcerated woman because he convinced the state of Washington to put him in a woman's prison. I think it's interesting, though, this... So it says she has been in solitary confinement for months, and that constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Well, as the Seattle Times goes to point out, the decision to be in solitary confinement was his decision. They wrote, I'm just reading the Seattle Times article, they call he a she, whatever it is. When she was moved to Monroe, Kim elected to be housed in solitary confinement rather than enter general population with men. She has been in solitary for about 6 months now, excluding a short transfer for gender-affirming surgery. Yeah. So, I mean, they're giving Brian Kim, double murderer, everything he wants behind bars, including a transfer so he could get gender-affirming surgery. We are being denied our humanity in a systemic way. Being in isolation like this is soul-sucking, Kim said. They're literally quoting a double murderer who is whining that he's being denied his humanity, and it's soul-sucking. Like, I mean, the Seattle Times, could you not reach out to any people who loved the 2 individuals who Brian Kim killed and ask them if they felt like those murders were, those victims were denied their humanity? That what happened to them was soul-sucking, quite literally, because they were taken off the face of the earth. And now you've got Brian Kim, Amber Faye Fox Kim, whatever your preference is, who routinely is given some of the most influential and wide read or consumed news outlets in the state to air their grievances about how they're treated in prison. You guys, this is insane stuff. So the Seattle Times gives a little background on the trans prison population. Says about 2% of the incarcerated adults in Washington state have self-identified as transgender or non-binary, 284 people. The department has had 22 transgender people in a facility that aligns with their gender identity since the process of gender-affirming housing, according to DOC. So of the entire state prison population, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people, we're talking about 22 people really, who are impacted by the sort of want to be in a prison that doesn't align, where the rest of the population is their birth gender, or they don't align with whatever it is. So we're talking about such a small fraction of prison inmates, yet look how much attention, money, dedicated doctor, dedicated services, free surgeries that are purely cosmetic. They want to say this is about physical and mental health, like these are necessary surgeries. These are purely cosmetic surgeries. So they get all these things, and on top of that, they get 1,500 words in the Seattle Times to complain about their treatment when they're being waited on behind bars, hand and foot, regardless of the severity of their crime. They also, in this article, go on to talk to an advocate, an advocacy organization for incarcerated LGBTQ plus people. And this whole Seattle Times article is just absolutely hook, line, and sinker on the gender identity stuff. It's very disheartening that a year ago, I was actually really impressed with the direction that Washington DOC was going. They were actually in the process of becoming a national leader in transgender care for individuals who are incarcerated, said Haley Ochinga, the executive director of Beyond These Walls, an advocacy organization for incarcerated LGBTQ plus people. But then she goes on to say that the last few months, the state of Washington, the DOC, really started backsliding. We've increasingly heard more and more of transgender women who have been returned to men's prison in general population after their surgeries. They fear for their safety every single day, which part of me, that kind of gives me hope, like, oh, it's backsliding? If the person who thinks it's perfectly appropriate to put a biological man in a women's prison thinks Washington State's Department of Corrections is backsliding, that's probably a good thing for those of us with common sense. Like maybe some of this attention, some of these stories about how women who are incarcerated in the women's prison feel when they're forced to bunk with a biological man. Maybe some of those stories are sinking in. I don't know. I don't have a lot of hope, but that's part of it. They talked to another 50-year-old transgender woman, Erica Assad, who's housed at the Monroe Corrections Complex, said the treatment of trans people often varies depending on what facility they're housed in. At prisons in more conservative areas of the state, she said staff are more likely to misgender incarcerated people or ignore allegations of being preyed upon by cisgender men. You guys, this is a news story from the Seattle Times. And they are honest to God. You don't get into Monroe unless you did something serious. They are honest to God, just using their platform to share the complaint of a prison inmate who says that in certain prisons in our state, they get misgendered. They get misgendered, and they're preyed upon by the cisgender. I mean, it's what did Dory used to do? The woke word dice. I mean, you could woke word dice all day on the Seattle Times article. So they go back to hearing from Kim, the double murderer at the center of this. Kim said she hopes that she'll be returned to the Washington Correction Center for Women, where he broke the rules by having sex with a woman there in a cell. That's non-consensual. You can't have consensual sex in prison. Seattle Times is basically advocating for them to get sent back to a women's prison where they broke the rules by having sex with a woman as a man, with all their appendages intact. Kim said she hopes that she'll be returned to the Washington Correction Center for Women, but she also hopes her petition forces the Department of Corrections to reconsider how they treat incarcerated people. Prison is supposed to be limited to a loss of liberty, Kim stated in her declaration to the appellate court, but prison is not supposed to include the loss of the pursuit of happiness. You guys, that's a double murderer. That's a double murderer. Brian Kim was convicted of and is currently incarcerated because 2 counts, aggravated murder in the first degree, killed his parents, Richard and Teresa Kim, never mentioned by name in that Seattle Times article. Richard Kim was stabbed to death. Teresa Kim was strangled to death by Brian Kim, who the Seattle Times is now completely willing to use. Oh, Amber Faye Fox Kim, he or her, she, her, and they're losing. They're complaining. They're losing their pursuit of happiness behind bars. You killed 2 people. You stabbed your dad to death, and you strangled your mom to death. The Seattle Times had like the smallest little. I just want to read this mention. Hold on. It was in here. I got to pull it back out. 1 second. I want to read you what they said. The only mention of this. Kim, this is the only mention. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 paragraphs down. Kim says she's being denied her humanity. And then it says, Kim, who is serving a life sentence for 2 counts of first-degree murder, spent years at men's prisons in Washington. There, she said she endured physical and sexual violence. Only reference to what this inmate did. The rest of it is total sob story. I'm being denied my humanity. I'm being denied my pursuit of happiness. I have to be in solitary confinement by my own choice because I don't feel safe around the men. Even though as a man, when I was in the women's prison, I had non-consensual sex with another woman. And you don't think that woman might have felt forced or whatever it is, or coerced? How do I say no to this man? You can't have consensual sex behind bars. So I broke the rules. I broke a serious rule, and I got sent back to the man's prison. And all I have to do is reach out to the Seattle Times, and they will spin my sob story to all of their readers. And they will hardly even mention that I'm in here because I stabbed my dad to death and I strangled my mom to death. The media is absolutely dead. But this just shows you, again, for me, it really is about, it's not so much like, I do I have anything against Brian Kim personally? I mean, he killed 2 people, so in that sense, yes. But like, honestly, if Brian Kim wants to be behind bars, Amber Faye Fox Kim, and strut around Monroe Prison, presenting as a woman to the best of their ability, I don't care. But I do care if we're going to pay for his gender reassignment surgery. I do care when we're being told we need to pay for his laser hair removal. I do care when we're being told it's no big deal that he is going to be put in a prison with women, many of whom do not want him there, or any other man in their cells for that matter. And I do care when we're told that we're transphobes for saying that. And I do care when the media, which is supposed to really think critically about these issues, is going to spin a sob tale for a double killer and not even mention the heinous nature of their crime. What are the family and friends, if there's any surviving ones left, he killed both of the parents, what do they think about this? What do they think about Brian Kim being able to, whenever they reach out to the media, get 1,000 words in the Times or in the Stranger to share their sob story about how their humanity is being taken from them behind bars? Does the Seattle Times care? Did the Seattle Times try to reach out to anyone? Victims advocates, anything? Did they care to consider how stories like this might make victims feel? It goes lockstep with the Democratic priority in Olympia of the criminals have more rights than the victims. The criminals are treated like victims. The criminals get handouts. The criminals get special treatments, and the rest of us just get jack shit. So that's why I care so much about this trans agenda nonsense, because it does separate the people who have common sense from the people who do not. And unfortunately, the Seattle Times is showing that it is in the group of the people who do not have any common sense. Yet they're the largest newspaper in the state of Washington. That's scary stuff.